Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 3 of mya222, Maya Foundations, Look Dev and Lighting. So what we're going to do in this class is really carry on directly from where we left off last week with our lighting and our final rendering of the shot. So our plan is to set up some general lighting that's going to first of all match the spheres roughly. Then we're going to take that further through into the teapot, and then once that's set up we're going to bring in our high dynamic range image, which we would have turned off, and then once we've got everything tied in we will then go ahead and maybe retexture the teapot slightly, render out, and then maybe do a little bit of comp if we have time. So let's begin where we left off last week, which is with our file I've got loaded here, week 03_01. So the first thing we want to do is take our high dynamic range image and we want to turn off everything apart from the environment, and this is under the render stats. So no primary visibility, no secondary reflections, refractions or final gathering. We're also in our render settings, which is turning the overall quality, lighting quality down to 0.5, indirect off, and the material quality down to 0.5 as well. So that's all off. And you can see here we've got our enabled default lights still switched off from last time. So if we do an initial render, this is what we're going to get. You can see what we've got coming up is a completely black table because there's no lights in the scene. And what we are seeing here are just the lights, or reflections rather, from our high dynamic range image. So that's what you're seeing, the reflection of the lights here that's coming from the high dynamic range image that's in the scene surrounding it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set up some initial lights, and we want to set up a light from the sun and a light from these lights here that we see in the high dynamic range image. So let's go ahead and do that using a create light and area light. And everything we tend to do in this kind of lighting tends to be area lights because we're looking to build a somewhat physically plausible scene, and the area lights are the ones that give us the most physically plausible setup. So I brought in my area light. I could, if I wanted to, turn on area lights here under the mental ray tab, and I could say that we want to use the shape, and we could choose a rectangle, disc, etc. Because the first one I'm going to do is going to be the sun, I'm going to make that a disc. And I've got the ability to set samples and visibility on that if I want to. I'm probably going to switch on visibility just for the time being, and if we render that, you can see what's going to show up in our render is actually going to be the reflection of that light. So you can see there it is in our scene. Okay, so probably for what we want to do, I'm just going to keep that off. Shape intensity we could turn up if we wanted to, but we're just going to leave the whole thing off for the time being. From here, let's position this roughly where we want it. So I'm going to come into my perspective view. I'm going to scale this down because it's obviously going to be sunlight and it's going to come from quite a small area. And I'm going to move it out so it's roughly around the right place for the sunlight. And we know that's somewhere around here. I can then look through my light and I can adjust its position until it kind of faces down towards my object like so. And then I could choose if I wanted to move it into shot. So again, you can see there it is. If I do W, left mouse click, I can set this to be based on the object position, and then it will move directly down the line of the object. And I want to make sure that it's kind of heading towards my scene here. You can see because it's quite small, you don't get a huge amount of flexibility, so it's roughly going in the right direction. Just move it across, down, and back out. So that's going to be our sunlight. Now obviously this is really a kind of an infinite distance away, so positioning it here will probably be just fine. And what we're going to do, we're going to say that it has no decay, because that's really the way the sunlight works. It actually does decay over distance, but it is such a bright illumination source that the decay is really, I guess, millions, if not tens of millions of miles across. I don't actually know the distance, but obviously it's pretty bright by the time it gets to the Earth, and that's a long way from its initial source. So the decay rate on Earth of the sunlight is really minimal. You don't really notice it. So let's go ahead and go back to our camera view and let's just see what we get here. So again, let's do a render. And this will be our first bit of illumination coming from this light. You can see that's hitting our teapot pretty strongly there. And that's partly to do with, obviously, the amount of light we've got. This is still black, and that's all fine for the time being. And you can see we're getting pretty good illumination. Now, before we go too far down the line of trying to balance this, we need to get some of our other lights in the scene. So we want to get the lights in the ceiling in there too. So I'm going to first off just turn off our teapot, just so that isn't distracting. And our table here, we just want to make sure firstly that everything is facing the right direction. So I'm going to do a quick check on the normals. So we just come across to modeling. We want to come to display, polygons and normals. So face normals, and they're all facing in the right direction, so that's perfect. So again, let's just turn those off. So next up, let's add in our additional lights. So I'm going to create another area light. Just go to our perspective view, and I'm just going to rotate this light round. And you can use the hotkey J just to kind of snap this somewhere like that. And what would be ideal in this situation would be to know roughly how big this light really is. Obviously we don't have that information, so we're just going to wing it. The other thing that would be really useful would be to know how high this is off the surface, and we don't know that information, so I'm going to guess that somewhere around there. Now, we don't really know where this was in the scene. We've got some idea, and it feels like it may be kind of a little bit kind of forward or back. So I'm going to position it here for the time being, just in front. And we want to make sure that it's facing our light. So what I've done, facing our teapot rather, so we can hit W, and we should be able to then come in and just kind of control kind of where that's looking. So let's just make sure this is rotated facing down and towards our teapot here. And let's just see what that's going to give us. Now, all of this usually takes a really long time. It's not like a 2-minute job, and we obviously don't have very long because the class is quite short. So we're just going to kind of be throwing these in without too much care, and I'm going to leave you time to do that. Now you can see what we've got here. This has ended up pretty close to where we want it. So again, I'm going to just come into our mental ray. I'm going to set this to reflection, and it felt like it was a little bit small. So I'm just going to make sure that we enlarge this somewhere like that perhaps, and I'm going to then duplicate this and put it here, because they were two quite close to each other. Now what we want to do is we're going to obviously need to adjust these. So I'm going to make this one the master. So this will be master ceiling. And then this one will just be ceiling 2. Now if we want to, we can actually set an expression to drive the second light from the master. So I can do that by coming into the illumination here, or the intensity, right click, and I can come in and I can set an expression. The easiest way is just to come into edit and expression. So we just want to type in ceiling light 2 intensity equals master ceiling light dot intensity. So this is the expression we want to use. We just say edit and create, and you can see this goes pink. Now if we come in here and we make an adjustment, say 0.75, we come back to this one, you can see that that has now been reduced. So we now have control over both of them just by affecting one. So let's again call up our render. This time I'm going to go with the IPR. You can see now roughly what we're getting. And let's just begin to dial this in. So let's say on 0.85. Beginning to get quite a good match. Come back to our initial sunlight area, and I'm going to reduce this down to say 0.75. And these are now beginning to match. Now this black area here is obviously because we don't have any light under here. But the minute we switch on our high dynamic range image again, we're going to see all of that. So I'm going to bring in my high dynamic range image again. So what I'm going to do is come into render stats here, switch on adjust the environment color, and in here I can actually turn down the color gain. So you can say I can turn it down or I can turn it up. So I'm going to put it at a value of around say 0.5. That's going to begin to fill in some of the additional information. Now it looks like my ceiling lights are too big, so let's go back to our perspective and let's scale these down. So I'm going to grab both of them and let's scale these down in size. Back to our camera, and again let's do a quick render just to see what we're going to get. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. We're still getting too much illumination, so let's come into here, let's put on IPR, and we're just going to focus on these areas again. We're going to take our overall sunlight down, so let's come down to maybe 0.5. We should see that reduce, and then let's go with our area light. Let's try 0.75 or maybe 0.7 for those ones. So that's reduced, and then we're going to come into our final gathering and let's drop that down as well a little bit. Okay, so with a little bit of fiddling around, this is where I've ended up. I haven't spent too long, maybe 10-15 minutes just getting these into play, and you can see we're really close. A couple of things that probably need to change. I just tweaked my HDR here. I turn it down temporarily just to see how that would affect things, and that's obviously dropped the overall illumination. So I want to get that roughly back to 100%. So this is what we're looking at. Pretty close. This sphere, maybe it needs a little bit more work, a little bit more brightness. So we can come in and maybe just increase these just a little bit more. And as I've said, I've been putting these back and forth just to try and see what we're going to get. So again, let me just render this section, and this is probably as far as I'm going to take this. Okay, so pretty close now, pretty close. So let's now bring back the teapot and see what we get. So usually the next step would be that the teapot we would do as grey shades just to see what that looks like. But I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to render it with the red just so we can see what we're getting. The grey that you'd often do your model at this stage is really so that you don't have the material kind of interfering with the way that the lighting's working. You can just see it in a straight kind of grey shade just to get a feel for exactly what the light's doing without any displacement or without any colours or anything like that. So you can see we're getting something reasonably nice. Obviously we've got quite a lot of highlights in this, hot spots. And you'd expect that because we've obviously got lots of light sources going on. Okay, so there's our render done. You can see we're getting some really nice kind of light onto the table, and it's getting pretty close. The lights need to be slightly more adjusted so they actually end up in roughly the right place, but they're in a pretty good place at the moment. Also, what we need to do is make sure that we've got some stand-in objects for these books so that we kind of see some kind of kind of light blocking as we talked about last week in the reflection and just for the light. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly make a stand-in model that I'm just going to use for these books. Okay, so I've just made these stand-in objects, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically say that we don't want to see them. So I'm going to come to our render stats, and I'm going to turn off the primary visibility. We also don't want them visible in reflections or refractions. We don't really want them motion blurred, but they do cast shadows. So again, off for that one and off for that one. So if we now render the whole thing, what we should find is that we're getting firstly them just blocking the light, and then what we'll do after that is we'll switch on visible in reflections, and then we actually will see the shape in the teapot itself. Okay, so you can see now we're getting some nice light blocking from those objects. We're going to need to set this so that the reflections and the shadowing doesn't fall on the table, but we'll do that in a moment. We are, however, going to switch on show in reflections. So we want to actually see what these look like. And again, let's just render that. Now while that's rendering, one of the things we're going to need to do is, with regards to the table, we're going to put that into a separate render layer a little bit later, and we'll have that just working with the teapot but not with the books. And then we'll have the teapot in a layer with the books as well, so that they actually cast shadow onto the teapot in some way. But we'll set that up in a moment. Okay, so that's pretty much done, and you can see we're getting a really nice result. Really happy with that. So what I'm going to do now with the teapot is I'm just going to adjust the look of this. I'm going to change it under here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring down some of the reflectivity and some of the glossiness as well. So we're going to get something a little bit more matte. So we're going to bring down the weighting of the diffuse. We're going to change the color to be a little bit more, just a little bit more orangey. We can also come down to advanced reflections. We've got a bunch of things under BRDF, including the ability to adjust kind of how the correct Fresnel works. So we could put that on as well. That's going to give us a nicer result. Or we could come in and we could actually begin to pull this down to get a slightly different Fresnel angle. We can also adjust the BRDF curve itself. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. So that would have affected the teapot. So if we just call up the last image and we save it, and then we just focus in on the teapot and we do a render of that, you'll be able to see the difference. Okay, so that's what we're getting. It's looking much more realistic now, the texture setup. I'm much more happy with that. So this is all looking good. It obviously needs more tweaking, but for the time we've got, I'm pretty happy with what we've got going on here. Okay, so what I've done is I've gone in and I've spent a little bit of time just looking at render layers, because it works very slightly differently in this version of Mental Ray, which I'll show you in a moment. And it took a bit of time just to work out what the best method of putting all this together would be. Most of it you'll probably be very familiar with, because I've used similar techniques to what's been shown in the past, either by myself or other professors, and some of it is slightly different just due to the fact that Mental Ray has changed. So let me first of all just show you the render passes. I'm going to come in and open up our render settings here, and if I come over to scene, you can see that this is now quite different. The frame buffer that used to be right down at the bottom is now at the top, and it's preset to half float, 4 channels of 16-bit each, and then all the render passes are here. So let's just close down what we don't need. So you can see here all the passes. So these are pretty straightforward. You literally just click on what you want. So I've switched on diffuse for direct and indirect, and diffuse for glossy and speck. Though I'm probably not going to use them. I put them on anyway just to see what we're going to get. I've also added a refraction if we wanted it, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to use it. So I may just go ahead and just turn that off completely. We also can come in here and say the data type is for these 3 channels of 16-bit. So you could have these data types differently. And the data types you can see down here are depth, motion vector, and ambient occlusion. So they're in there as well if I want to use them. So I've basically just thrown on some generic ones, but I don't think I'm going to really get too far into using those for this particular project. You can see it's very different to the original, or how Maya used to be on the last version. Everything else is pretty much the same. I'm going to render to OpenAXR, zip compression, and I'm doing half res 960 by 540 just for speed really. If you want to render full HD you can, of course. So let's just shut down this and have a look at the first render pass that I'm doing. My thinking is that I need to obviously composite the teapot into the background plate, but I need to capture a couple of things. I need to capture the shadows of the teapot onto a surface, and I also need to capture the reflections. So let me talk to you first about the teapot. What I've done is I've taken the table and I've completely got rid of it in this layer. I've taken the books that we're going to be using, and you can see here that I've basically said they can cast shadows and they can be visible in reflections. So I've done that to all of them, but they do not receive any shadows, not that that would make any difference. And most importantly, the primary visibility is off. So this basically means, as you can imagine, and as we saw earlier, that we only have them in the reflections, but you don't actually see them themselves in the scene. So if I just come in and just drop my settings here, my quality settings, I'm just going to set these to 0.25 really for speed. I've already done some pre-renders at 1, so you'll get to see what's going on. And let's just go ahead and do a render. So you can see, as we were getting before, we have our teapot with the blockers, the light blockers, and their reflection onto the teapot. If we go and look at the alpha channel, you'll see that we just have a straight alpha of the teapot, which is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to save that, keep that image, and close that down. The next layer is, say, the shadow. So this one's pretty straightforward. I've taken the table and I've basically assigned to it a specific material. And I'm sure you're very aware of this one. This is called Use Background. And this is useful if you basically want a material that will capture shadows and reflections, but kind of become in itself translucent. So what I've done is I've said I don't want any specular color, and I don't want any reflectivity, because these are obviously for reflection, and we're simply interested in the shadow. I've then taken the reflection limit down to 0 as well. That I wouldn't necessarily need to do that because reflectivity was down. But the shadow matte here I've kept at 1, which is its default setting. That basically means that we're going to get a matte where the shadow lies or falls on this surface. Now also in here I have my lights, and if we look at my individual elements in the attribute editor under the, let's come back to here where we can get hold of them. Under the render stats, you can see the floor itself is just standard. You can see everything, it receives shadow, cast shadows, everything is on as normal. The teapot, however, you can see here, this is orange. Now you're probably aware, but what I've done is, because this is on a specific layer, I've right clicked and I've said add layer override. So if I do it on one that isn't orange, you can see create layer override. And on this particular layer, what I've done is I've gone in and I've turned off primary visibility. So that means for this particular render layer, so this particular render layer here, we're not going to see the teapot itself. All we're going to see is the floor and whatever's going on with that. Now I could have included the books in here, but there's really no point because the books themselves cast their own shadow onto the real tabletop, so I don't need to put them there. They were simply there to block the light and cast any kind of shadow onto the teapot or any pseudo reflections that I might need. So I don't need them in this section. So what we're looking to get is basically a flat table with our shadows on it. So let me go ahead and do a render of that. You'll also note for all of this I've turned off the background plate. Now for some reason, and I haven't been able to figure out why, we're still seeing in here the reflection of, or not really the reflection, it's kind of the HDR image. And I've tried several things to get rid of it. In fact, you can see at the moment it's actually hidden, so there's no reason to see this, but it is in there. The good thing is this comes with an alpha channel, which is the thing that we're most interested in. So what's happening in the RGB we really don't care too much about. All we want is the alpha. Okay, so that's there. I'm going to make sure for my render that this is back on, so Shift H just so the high dynamic range image is there for when I do the rendering of the main teapot. Okay, now the next things are the reflection. So if I come through the reflection pass, you can see here we actually have a MIA material X node. And what I've done here is I've taken the diffuse and I've turned everything down. So the color is black, the weighting is at 0, and the roughness is at 0. The weighting is really how much we're getting of the diffuse. So 0 means you're getting nothing. I've then taken the reflection and I've made the color white. The reflectivity I've put to 1, which is kind of full 100%, and I've made the glossiness 1 as well. What that's basically going to do is give us kind of mirror sharp reflections. I'm going to go in later on and potentially blur those in Nuke if I want to, but for the time being I want those nice and crisp. The other thing that you could do if you wanted to is you could come in here and use this maximum distance. What this basically does is it says in kind of Maya units how much of the reflection actually takes place. So if you imagine it switched on and set to 0, the distance from the object reflecting and the reflection itself at 0 will give us no reflection. If I increase this to say 0.5, we may only get the reflection for half the amount before it kind of tails off to black. And if we then increased it, say, to 1 or 2, we would see all of the reflection. And then after 2 units, again, it would kind of tail off. So this is really useful if you want to have control over the reflections so that something close to the object reflects, but something a long way away, which is actually more physically accurate. Things in the distance don't reflect or appear at all. So you could use this if you want. I did some tests and basically really you're going to see the whole thing because the distance is so small. So I've turned that off for the time being. The only other thing you may want to do is come in and adjust this use Fresnel reflection. And if you switch that on, then it basically sets up the Fresnel properly for the reflection and the angle of the surface. I've ended up just saying I want to keep that to give me the full reflection. So I've set 0 reflection to 0 and 90-degree reflections to 1. So that gives me full reflections, which is actually probably accurate for what I need here. Okay, but normally with this on, you're going to get the whole situation. If you imagine with a car, if you look at the front door facing you or you look across the roof, you're going to see different amounts of reflection based on the kind of Fresnel of looking straight at it or looking across at the glancing angle. So I'm actually going to leave this off. Okay, it's probably not perfectly physically accurate, but it works great for what I need, and I know looking at it I'm getting the right thing. Okay, so that is what I've done for the surface. The teapot, again, I've basically said that the primary visibility is off. It's not visible in reflections, not that that matters because you're not going to get any reflections. And I've also turned off receive shadows, but that again doesn't really make any difference. So all I'm looking to get is the reflection on this surface of the teapot. So let me do a render again so you can see what this looks like. So you can see that's the alpha, and if I just switch over to the color, there is my really nice reflection, and that's obviously the edge of the shelf there where that cuts off. So that's looking great, so I'm going to save that as well. So we've got our reflection and our teapot. So you can see they're working great. The next thing I've got is this reflection matte. Now the reason why I had a matte is because if we go back and look at the actual render I just got, you can see what we've got here is obviously the red of the reflection. And normally what you'd want to do is you'd want to plus the reflection on top of the background. Now because the background plate is white and we're going to be plussing this on top, basically what's going to happen is this red is really going to disappear. We're only going to get the smallest hint of it. So what I decided I wanted to do instead was have more control, because I'm going to need it in the composite. And so I thought, well, what I could do is I can actually make a reflection that is pure white. That way I can then use that reflection that will be perfectly matched to the red one, but it will act as a matte. And then I can actually over the reflection based on the matte and then mix it down to the level that I think works. So if I come to the matte here and I again just do a render, you're going to see we're going to get pretty much exactly the same thing, but it's going to be pure white instead of red. So there you have it. So that is going to work as a matte for this reflection. So you can see it's working just great. Obviously the teapot is going to fit in this section here, so that's all going to be fine. So from here, let's go ahead and render all these layers. So our shadow layer, our reflection, and our reflection matte, and the actual teapot themselves. So all I can need to do is just come into render and batch render, and I'm just going to render a single frame because there's no need for me to render the whole sequence at this point. So let's just render one frame. Okay, so my render's finished, and you can see what I've done is I've transitioned over into Nuke just to talk you through how I did the final composite. Now obviously time has gone on, so we don't have much time in the class left. So I'm just going to whiz through this, which is why I didn't want to build it in the class, because I knew it would take probably an hour to set all this up if I was doing it in real time. So right at the top, you can see that we have our original background plate. And what I've done here is I've just shuffled white into the alpha. I tend to always do that. I like to have white in my alpha. I've then taken my chrome and my grey spheres, and I've added those into my background plate. And this section is really exactly the same as it was when we did the first Nuke setup for the high dynamic range and just prepping the plate ready for lighting. I've then taken the plate that's 1080 and I've dropped it down to half HD just so it matches with my renders. I've then taken all of my parses and I've actually composited them together in its own mini composite before laying it over the background plate. So let me show you how I've done this. First thing we have is obviously the shadow pass, and we had that issue with the shadow pass where we were still seeing this image in the RGB. Now that didn't really matter because what I was most interested in was obviously the alpha channel. That's where the shadow is stored. So what I've done is I've said I'm going to use this, and I'm going to use this constant node to actually enable me to tint the shadow. And I'll show you why I want to tint it in a moment. So I'm going to keep this off. I'm going to take my alpha and I'm just shuffling that or copying it from my alpha channel into red, green, blue and alpha. So at this point, red, green, blue and alpha are exactly the same. I'm then copying that into the alpha channel of my constant. So here's my constant with no alpha, and here I've copied in the alpha at this point. And it could obviously, I could get rid of this shuffle if I want, but I like to do it just in case you come here and look at it, you can see what's going on. It doesn't really add any overhead to the comp, so it's fine to be there. I've then gone in and I've actually blurred the alpha channel, and I've done this just so that my shadow looks a little bit closer to the shadow in the background plate, and this was done after I'd done the initial composite, so it was kind of a second pass to get everything integrated. I knew at this point that this shadow was falling across my books, and I already had a matte for the books that I'd used earlier, so I'm just going to basically do a stencil of this alpha based on this alpha, and that's going to give me this. And then I'm going to pre-molt the whole thing, so I'm going to end up with RGB that looks like this. Now this is literally coming from this image here, so you can see as I adjust the color of the constant, it's affecting the color of my shadow. And then I'm obviously doing the pre-molt so that the alpha cuts out the color. So that's all done, and if I was to show you the grade, this is the tint that I've added to the shadow, and you'll see why I've done that in a minute. Next up is the reflection pass. If you remember, we have the initial reflection pass with the alpha of the table, and then we have the pass here, which is the reflection kind of matte that we used from the self-illumination of the teapot, which gave us this kind of white reflection. So I'm copying the red channel, could be green or blue, but red is fine, into the alpha. That gives me this with an alpha channel, which is exactly what I want. And then I'm grading that to give it a particular color. Now the reason why I'm grading it is because actually I initially graded the teapot because it felt like it was too bright in the plate, and then I came back and I added the grade back onto the reflection so that the teapot and the reflection both had the same grade on. So I'm going to leave it off for the moment just so you can see the difference. Then we have the teapot itself. So I've got the teapot here. I do a very slight transformation just to drop it down slightly. I felt it needed it. And then that gets put over the shadow and the reflection. That all then has a lens distortion applied that's really not doing anything at all because the image is really close into the middle of the plate, but it's there in case I needed it. And then I'm putting all of this over the top of the background plate that gives me that. Now the shadow, you can see, is there, but I could make it black obviously, but what I wanted to do was actually grade it so it matched this shadow here. So you can see if I grade it, they then tie in nicely. You'll also notice that the teapot feels like it's kind of really standing out. It's super bright and saturated. So that's where I came in and I graded it down, and then I needed to grade my reflection as well. So that's the grade, and they're basically the same grade, just cloned, which is why they're both working together. So I was much more happy with that. Now at this point we basically had some integration to do. So I did my old favorite, the light wrap, and you can see if I come in here, it's very subtle, on and off. That's the light wrap coming in, and from a distance you hardly see it, but it just gives a little bit of something. And then here I've made a matte because I wanted to make an edge matte for this. So the way I've done that is I've taken the alpha channel and I've basically done an erode here and then an erode, but I've inverted it. So I end up with one erode, two erodes, but if you look where my mouse is, there's actually some distance between the two. This erode is going to 1 and this erode is going to -1. And I've used an expression here just to basically show how that's done. So I've said minus erode 1, which is this node, or rather erode 2, and then the knob that adjusts the size, which is just called size. So basically the upshot is as I adjust this up, this one goes negative, goes down, and that creates a matte that looks like this. I've then inverted the whole thing, and I've then come over and I've copied that into a custom layer and channel called Teapot as the layer name, and the channel is Edge Blur, which is the first channel that I made. So in nuke terms, it's going to go into, if we just come back to the color, it's going to go into Teapot, and then Edge Blur being the first channel will be red. So that gives me that. I've then taken a blur node and I've done a 1.25 blur based on that particular channel. So if we come in here and I show you the blur, you can see all I'm doing is just blurring kind of the top and bottom, the teapot into the background plate. So I like to do that. You could use an edge blur as well, but I don't feel like it does the same thing. This way I'm actually blurring it once it's on top of the plate, as opposed to kind of blurring the edge of the object and then compositing it. It's only subtle, but I feel that this gives a better result. All of this has ended up giving me a slightly bigger bee box. It's not particularly huge, but it's a little bit bigger, so I always like to crop that back down. And then finally, the whole look I just felt was a little bit too kind of washed out. So I've done what you could really describe as just a final grade or DI of the entire image, and that gave me this. So this is my final composite, and I'm really happy with what I've got here. So this has brought us to the end of our 2-week project. Obviously this compositing section I've gone through a little bit quick, but that isn't really going to be the focus of these classes, or not at the moment anyway. So I'd love to see your composites and your final renders from the tests that I'm hoping you're doing along with the class. So please post those in the forums. Any questions you've got on all of this setup, in how we organize placing the lights, or how we did any of the layers, or anything like that, please let me know in the forums and I'll answer them as quick as I can. We're obviously going to continue going into this subject because that's what the point of the whole course is about. So this really feel like this is just kind of scratching the surface. So until next week, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.